Silverhorn Beast King Calamity Magnolia Masques. This card could only be written from a grade 3 with Magnolia in its card name, but continuous on Vanguard Circle. During your turn, all of your rear guards on Dragon Tree markers can attack from the back row and get an additional 10k power, making it a total of 15k thanks to the 5k that the Dragon Tree marker already gives. Then finally, it has an axe skill on Vanguard Circle once per turn where you can remove a Magnolia with a different card name from this card from hand, soul, or drop to have this Vanguard get this skill where whenever your back row attacks a Vanguard, you can choose one of your opponent's units and retire it. Magnolia Masques is my second favorite deck to come out of set 12, probably my second favorite actual mask deck of all time. And that's for two reasons. One, it actually makes use of the Dragon Tree marker mechanic exceptionally well. In the other mask deck, it was just a thing that you would get, you'd have this marker, it really didn't matter. It only really mattered for Gilia, who can actually get power and restand units with those. The second reason is that Magnolia Masques as a deck actually uses Counter Blast in what I feel like was its intended purpose, making it have way more value. One Counter Blast gives you an additional attack for the entirety of the game until, Jiva comes out and can actually remove markers, an additional attack for the entirety of the game because you get the Dragon Tree marker that you can attack from the back row with. In addition to that, that unit also gets an additional 15k thanks to both Magnolia Masques and a 10k power. All of that from one Counter Blast. In general, I think Magnolia Masques is a really great and amazing deck. It is not perfect, it is not the supreme best deck. It does have a couple of flaws that we'll get into, but I think it's actually really fun to, especially deck builds, because you have so many different options that you can go through. Here's the list. Let's jump into this deck profile. Got some quick little sample gameplay for you before we dive into more details about this deck. My fiance here on the left is playing Magnolia. It's a slightly different build than the one we're going to be talking about today. You can see it here, and I'm playing Heroes on the right side. She's playing the new Silverhorn Rabbit with the Lattice from the first set as the Rideline, but we'll talk about more of that in a bit. But typically, this is what your grade 2 turn is going to look like. You're going to take a swing from your opponent, and then you're just going to go into your Dragon Tree setter and then play it to get a Dragon Tree marker. The big misconception that a lot of people have is that they believe that this deck uses up a ton of Counter Blast, it's completely unplayable, you have to get 6 markers in one turn, which is completely unreasonable. What you do instead is that you, over the beginning of the course of the game, you get several markers built up. As your opponent attacks you, you get some Counter Blast, and then you can very easily get the 2 or 3 markers in your grade 3 turn, allowing you to have 6 attacks right away. And that's really how you want to play the deck. You can very easily get cards from your drop in order to get back those marker setters, so on and so forth. So it's not really this insane sort of thing as people make it out to be in terms of how costly the deck is. Plus, you don't need to use Counter Blast or anything else aside from that and the Force Glow Dragon. That being said, here we're going to get hit with a crit, the Magnolia side, which is going to put them at 4 damage, which does suck for the deck, but the deck is very good at being able to use Counter Blast to come back, because you can very easily use that Counter Blast to then get a lot of markers, get a lot of extra attacks. Here we're going to see the Lattice come into effect here, able to bring out from the top card a Sarah, which is really good. You can then actually use the skill of Sarah at that point in time to then look at top 5 to search for Magnolia Masques, but she decided not to. She's going to go ahead and go into the Magnolia Masques using the skill, and then using the skill of the grade 1 here to call it out from drop. Whenever you ride a Magnolia Masque, the rabbit here can actually come out, and it's going to be 13k because it actually gets plus 5k. So it's a nice little card to have in your ride deck, just so you always have some sort of recursion whenever you need it. On a marker, it's fine that it's a grade 1. You can also even use it to boost to have a huge booster, which is actually what's going to happen here, as she's going to use the Alpin and the Sarah to swing with a massive attack. And that's kind of the strengths of this deck, is that you can kind of choose which would hurt your opponent more, a really big attack or maybe 2 smaller attacks. And that kind of just depends on what your opponent has drawn into, checked, what they've discarded, so on and so forth, using that knowledge and the deck that they're playing to try and determine at this point in time whether or not you should swap out your attacks and your attack pattern and make it a single attack, or make it, more higher number of attacks. But for the most part, it's very easy to just get all of the markers that you need to progress through the game on your first grade 3 turn, which means going second, you can very easily, if you have something like a Sarah, Persona Ride, and have a massive turn where your whole board gets plus 10k power and you can get 5 to 6 attacks very easily, while your opponent just had their first grade 3 turn. Even if you go first, you can still do that minus the Persona Ride buff. This actually makes the deck play pretty well into a lot of the top decks that we have right now, as a lot of them aren't prepared for this sort of rush on the first grade 3 turn, although maybe even on still grade 2. You're going to see here a relatively strong turn here. There is going to be one small misplay, which we'll talk about in a bit, but we're going to see the Force Glow Dragon come down here. The Force Glow Dragon is amazing because for each marker you have when this card is placed, you can counterblast one and call a card from your drop. So you have 2 markers, you can call it to 2 units, which you can see here, and that allows you to very easily just come back from any sort of board wipe, but also fix your board, as well as let you get extra markers. You can very easily get something from drop that you used to get a marker, then again get another marker with it. The deck overall isn't very good when it comes to being defensive. It's a lot more of an aggressive all-in style deck, but it does have the added benefit in that it is very strong in the deck thinning department, and you are more likely to check your triggers since you're taking a lot of things out from your deck, and also maybe even draw into those triggers to then use them to defend. Unfortunately, it's not until later on where we get the promo that lets you intercept from the back row that this deck becomes a little bit more balanced out, because you'll be able to countercharge the main phase and also intercept from the back row. The misplay I was talking about here is that the Magnolia player forgot to use the skill of the Magnolia Masques to remove the original Magnolia, so that whenever a unit in the back row attacks, you can retire one of your opponent's units. Since there were 6 attacks done this turn on Persona Ride with the Sero, pretty much every attack was 2 or more cards to guard. If you combine that with the fact that 3 of my cards will get retired from the back row attacking in combination with the Magnolia skill, me as the player or the opponent would be in a horrible position, losing my whole board and many cards in my hand. And that's one of the strongest parts of Magnolia, is that you can very easily decimate your opponent's board as well as their hand. In general, you can always decimate their hand because you can just pump out so many strong and such a high volume of attacks super easily. So first things first, for the Ride deck, we're going to have here the Silverhorn Beast Lottie as the grade 0. You can put whatever you want in this spot. Then next up, we're going to have the Ranker Chain in the grade 1 spot. This says on Vanguard Circle, you Soul Blast 1, draw 2. Then you have to discard 1 order. If you don't have an order in your hand, you have to discard 2 cards. You can, if you want, let's say if you have like 2 cards that you want to discard, you can actually discard like an order and that card if you want, or just discard those 2 cards. But in general, this is just used to go through your deck quicker, and also it combines with the Black Tears Husk Dragon, who says on Ride, you can choose an order from your drop, add it back to your hand. This works out in 2 different ways. You can get an order that you maybe used on turn 1 back into your hand, or you can do something like maybe get the order that you discarded for the cost of Ranker Chain. And then finally, for the grade 3, we have here the original Silverhorn Beast King Magnolia. We have to play this in the Ride deck. You need this to ride your Magnolia Masques. That's the first condition for Magnolia Masques, is that you have to be on a grade 3 that's Magnolia to ride it in the first place. This has a skill that says when it attacks at the end of the battle, it can select one of your rear guards, give it 5k, and it can attack from the back row. But if you Persona Ride, you can select 3 instead of 1. We will 99% of the time never go into the skill and thing unless things go horribly wrong, but even then it's probably not even worth to do that. For the grade 3s here, we're just going to be playing 4 copies of the Magnolia Masques. I need to get, I have 1 FFR coming in the mail and I have to get 1 more. But this can only be written over grade 3 with Magnolia in its card name, so you can ride over itself to Persona Ride, but you need the original Magnolia to get it in the Vanguard Circle to begin with. On your turn, all of your rear guards on Dragon 2 markers get plus 15k or plus 10k and can attack from the back row. It becomes 15 in addition to the marker already giving you plus 10k, plus 5k power here. And then finally, you can remove the original Magnolia from your hand, soul, or drop to have the skill where whenever your back row attacks, you can retire one of your opponent's units. This comes up quite a lot, actually. It's a shame that there's really not a huge need to play this more than 1. There are some arguments for playing more than 1, but being able to retire is really strong, specifically in Magnolia, who themselves is very susceptible to retire, so being able to control your opponent's board as well does sort of make that matchup a lot more fair. The last grade 3 we're going to be playing here is the Mask of Hidragroom that you need to play in this deck. We're going to be playing 2 copies here because we have a lot of ways to get it, and we don't really need to play it too much to search it. You can play this at 3 if you'd like. This just says when you play it, look at top 5 cards of your deck, add a card that either has Mask or Dragon Tree in its name. That's a unit, add it to your hand. You can't add this because this has Mask no S, and it's also not a unit. Then it says in drop, if you have a grade 3 Vanguard that does not have mask in the name, you can then reveal a grade 3 with mask and write it as stand. Then you take this card from your drop, put it into your soul, and if your opponent is on grade 3 and you didn't Persona Ride this turn, you activate Persona Ride. So this is extremely good just to allow you to get your Magnolia Mask on board for one, but it also allows you to Superior Ride into it on your first grade 3 turn, and also gives you the Persona Ride if you went second. As this is a Magnolia deck, the grade 2s are the bulk of the list. So we have here the first grade 2 is the Dragon Tree Wretch, Dep Elwith, the Serpent. This says on place, Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, place a Dragon Tree marker on a circle that does not have a Dragon Tree marker, then search your deck for a Mask of Hydreigon. This is the main target that you want to use to get your markers, and specifically to get your Mask of Hydreigon, you want to get at least one of those out in play just so you can either discard it for Ride or use it that grade 3 turn just so you can have it in drop and use its in drop skill. But you know, the main purpose of this is to get you those markers so that you can actually be able to attack from the back row and give your units power. Right now we're playing here 2 of the Silverhorn Beast Godot. Recently I took out a 3rd copy, or my fiance I should say took out a 3rd copy. We've been messing around with this build so much that I've done this video like I feel like this is the 5th time me re-recording this deck profile just because I make minor changes that I'm not happy about it, or she makes minor changes that she's not happy about. But right now, running 2 of the Godot, originally 3, and essentially 2 of the Alpen, because they kind of do the same thing. Godot has one skill that says you ride a Vanguard with Magnolia in your ride space specifically, so it doesn't work with the Superior Ride of the Mask. But if you ride a card with Magnolia, during your ride phase, you can put this into Soul if you don't already have a copy of this card to give that Vanguard +5. So this, you know, bumps up your Vanguard and it gives you the Soul that you can use for all of your other cards. You used to be able to, in Elder, do this thing called Double Go, where if you have 2 of them here in drop, you can put one into Soul, give Elder 5k, then use the skill Elder to call this out. Then this other Go can actually also come into Soul from its own skill and give Elder another 5k. So you can swing over 23 that turn. You cannot do that in Magnolia Masques. The only way to do that is you play Lattice in the Rideline, and even then it's only going to apply to the original Magnolia, not Magnolia Masques. You'll lose the 5k when you ride over it. But the important part is the second skill here that says when this unit attacks from the back row, it gets plus 10k power, and if it's in the center back row, it can retire itself to draw a card. So this allows you to just draw cards, but mainly it's that it gets 10k power, because on a Dragon Tree marker, it becomes 35 without Persona Ride, which means that this automatically forces your opponent to guard with 2 cards, which is very important for this deck, as that's kind of the magic number you want to hit. As you know, if you get 6 cards, 6 attacks in a turn, your opponent has to guard all of them with 2 or more cards. That's maybe 12 cards that come out of their hand, and that's quite a lot and pretty difficult for any deck to be able to handle. So we kind of focus on doing that as soon as possible. So here we've got here the Silverhorn Beast Alpen, only at 2 copies, because it kind of works the same way as the Godot, except this can actually go in the front row. So this says when this attacks Vanguard, if you have a Vanguard of Magnolia, this gets +5 for every 2 of your units. So it says units, so it counts the Vanguard as well. So if you have this and just a Vanguard, it gets an additional 5k, but they have to be grade 2 or greater, which is why we're not running Alpen a lot of copies. He's really annoying because you have to run a lot of grade 1s, but Alpen doesn't like grade 1s. So this is actually going to get replaced with the Maleva promo that's going to come out pretty soon. I'm assuming like maybe February, we'll see. But if this gets 10 or more from that skill, you can bind this to countercharge Soul Charge. So this can get a total of 15k if you have a whole board of grade 2s, which can happen. But typically we play this so we can have this in the front row, so it can swing in hard in the front row, which is kind of one of the main weaknesses of this deck, is your back row is nice and chunky, but your front row doesn't really do too much, right? Even the Vanguard doesn't have that much crazy pressure because it's only just twin drive, no crit, no nothing. The last grade 2 that we're going to be playing here is the Force Glow Dragon, one of the strongest cards in this deck. Being a Magnolia deck, it has the obvious Magnolia weakness of being very weak and susceptible to board control. If you don't have a full board of units, you don't really do as much as you can. You barely do what you can. So this card is amazingly strong for this deck. However, we're only playing it at 3 copies because you could only really use this late in the game to an extent. Can't really use this early on. Maybe when we get to Maleva, you can maybe bump this up to 4 and play this a little bit more loosely. But this just says, when this is placed, other than during battle, you can counterblast 1 if you have a Magnolia Masques, specifically Vanguard. Choose greater or less units from your drop equal to the number of Dragon Tree markers you have and call them out to rear. So if you have 1 Dragon Tree marker, you call out 1 unit. If you have 3 Dragon Tree markers, you call out 3 units for counterblast 1. But if you have 0 Dragon Tree markers, you call out nothing, which is why this is kind of used later on when you have at least like 2. So you can actually get some value out of that. This card alone is just amazing for Magnolia in general, because this is what Magnolia needs. It needs a card that brings you multiple cards, because there's a lot of like 1-for-1 exchanges, 1 card that gets you 1 card, which isn't that great because you just need to most times fill up your entire board somehow. Then it has a second skill that says when this unit attacks, choose one of your Vanguards and give it 5k if it has Magnolia in their name. So you can use 2 of these to pump up your Vanguard to be 33 and to be a lot more threatening and harder to guard for your opponent. For the grade 1s here, we have here 2 copies of the Dragon Tree Wrench. I know for a fact that I opened 2 FFRs of this thing, but I can't find the second FFR, and it's been killing me that I can't find it. But this just says, on place, you counterblast 1 and get a Dragon Tree marker. Then, if you're on grade 3, on Act, on Rearguard Circle, you can counterblast Soul Blast and take a normal order from your drop and add it to hand. Both these skills are pretty useful. You typically only use the first skill, to be honest. You don't really have the way to just throw out Counterblast Soul Blast so often, but getting something back like your Misty Habitat, which we'll talk about next, is pretty useful, especially when you need to try and get some more units on board. But this is mainly used to get your Dragon Tree markers. This extra Wench was actually the GOAT that recently got taken out in the previous build of this deck. Next, for the grade 1s, it's going to be 3 copies of the Sylvanhorn Beast Sarrow. So on place, if this is placed from deck or hand, if you have a Sylvanhorn Beast, doesn't have to be Magnolia, Sylvanhorn Beast Vanguard, you can Soul Blast 1, look at the top 5 and add a card of Magnolia from it to your hand. This you can only use on grade 3, which is a bit unfortunate, which is why in the opener you saw stuff like using this rabbit in the Rideline and stuff like that, because this allows you to use Sarrow as soon as possible. Now you can only use Sarrow on turn 3, but to be honest, Sarrow's a little stinker, because every time you use this effect, I swear, like 80% of the time, you're going to miss it and not see a single Magnolia. You're going to see everything else except the Magnolia that you need to add to your deck, to your hand, which is kind of fair because you only have 4 of them that you play in the main deck, which is why, again, there's an argument to sometimes play an extra copy of this. But using this effect is not the highest priority, the first effect. It's the second effect that's really important, because it says, if you have a grade 3 Vanguard with Magnolia in its card name, if you Persona Ride, your Persona Ride increases the power of your back row as well. Only 1 of these applies, so if you have 3 of these, you don't get 30k to the back row, you just get 10k to the back row 1 time. So you really just need 1 of these, but it makes all of your stuff that's in the back row, if they're on a Dragon Tree marker, also they get plus 25, which is a huge buff to even just a grade 1 that can just swing in for 33k. So imagine something like a Godot, right? So that's mainly what we use Sarrow for. Last grade 1 unit we're going to have here is actually 1 copy of the Sylvanhorn Beast Leprechaun, which we saw in the opening as an option in the Rideline. So this says, in drop, if you ride Magnolia Masques specifically on Vanguard Circle, you can call it to rear and give it 5k. This works similar to the Go, except it doesn't have to be in ride phase, so it's a little bit better than something like a Maple, the grade 1 or grade 2 Maple, because those are only tied to the grade 2 being in ride phase and the grade 1 being in Persona Ride. Not that it matters too much, you can't use the grade 1 Maple in this deck because it doesn't count for the superior ride, so you would have to use it on your next turn when you Persona Ride. But this is just really nice to constantly have a unit out there. It also works out exceptionally well with the last order that we play in the deck, aside from the Elementaria, the Misty Habitat here. Because this deck does not have a lot of targets that you want to call out grades 1 and 2, which is kind of the main weakness of this deck. There's not a lot of good orders that you can play in this deck, which sounds like an insane thing to say. The main reason that we experimented with using, this and Lattice and the Rideline is that the orders weren't really benefiting too much for the deck. Why is that? Well, if you're playing Rancor Chain, you can't use Sarrow on turn 1, right? You don't want to do that. On turn 1, you can't bring this out. So you can't use this on turn 1, which kind of sucks. You can use it to get itself, which we'll talk about in a bit. But then on turn 2, you don't want to play out your dragons, right? You want to play these later on. You're not going to have markers. You're not a Magnolia Mask to do that. You can call out these guys. That's decent. And you can maybe call this out if you don't have one, which is really the prime target. But that's it, right? You can't call any of these cards out either. So the problem is that this deck has a lot of skills that are on place at very specific times, so it makes the Misty Habitat not be as great. But that being said, we're still playing 4 of it here. So this card says you look at the top 7 cards of your deck, choose up to 1 unit card with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard, and call it to rear, shuffle your deck. It also has 2 other skills that say, 1, when you were to search your deck for a unit card, this can count as a unit card. And also, when this would be called from deck to rear, you put it into your hand instead of drop. So the last part says, whenever you play this, in normal order, whenever you play it, any card that says play a card and you play an order, that order automatically, instantly fizzes out and goes to drop. Instead, this says instead of doing that interaction, add it to your hand. But it also says if you were to play something like this that searches as a unit, you can then hit this, add it to your hand, or call it out in this case, and then add it to your hand. So this also works with stuff like the Lattice, where if you see this, it can count as a unit, and you can call this out, I believe. Maybe not, because I think Lattice just reveals, it doesn't search. There's not really, I think, any card other than itself right now that this applies to be honest. So you don't really have to worry about that, but what you can do with this card right now is you can use it on turn 1. Try to see something like Teleport if possible. You can try and mill out your deck for like one of these guys if you have like extra copies, you know you're not going to need this, and you know you just want the skill of the Sarah, like you already have 2 Magnolia Masques in your hand. You can just use this to mill out the deck, but also mainly use it to get another copy of itself in your hand, so that the next turn you can, from the skill of the Ranger Chain or the Blackseer's Husk Dragon, you can add this back to your hand, have 2 of them, or add the other order. But then on turn 2 you can play this again, mill out your deck for 1 card. Ideally, not having to play any cards on turn 1, turn 2 that's not these orders is really good, because it allows you to keep that shield value in your hand from those units that you would rather, you know, maybe keep in hand if you can, so you can use them to guard. But like I said, there's not really the best targets for this order, and all the other orders are really expensive in terms of like calling stuff out and doing stuff. So Misty Habitat is in this weird spot where it's the best order in all of Sorkea, but it maybe doesn't really work the best with specifically Magnolia Masques. This again will probably change when we get to Maleva, who I think you can play out whenever. For the PGs here, we got ourselves 3 copies of the normal PG and 1 copy of the Elementarium. The normal PG here just says when you were to guard with this, you can discard a card, choose one of your units, and it doesn't get hit. So it's just a perfect guard, no damage is done. It is 6k, and it has a skill that says if you have 2 or more cards in your hand, you have to discard. If you have, you know, 1 or less, you don't, which is really nice. You can, if you have 2 of these, you can use 2 of them for free without having to discard. We're playing 1 copy of the Elementaria here. You could make an argument to switch this out for another copy of the unit one, because you want as many units as possible. There might be situations where you have to go for broke and just play out a unit, and this on a Dragon Tree marker is still going to hit for a decent number because of how much power the Dragon Tree markers give you. But we're playing the Elementaria here, which has the same effect as this, except it says if your opponent's Vanguard has triple drive, then you don't have to discard for this. Otherwise, if your Vanguard is grade 3, you can play this by discarding a card, choose a unit, and can't be hit. But it works as a blitz order, so it doesn't go into the Guardian Circle. So when you face something like Flagberg or something that has a guard restrict that says when you were to guard from hand, you have to play 2 or more cards, you can't play Sentinel, whatever the case may be. In Guardian Circle, this gets around that because it goes into the Order Zone instead of the Guardian Circle. For the triggers, we're going to be playing the Vanilla crits, a total of 7 of them. The reason we want to do that is because of the fact that, again, same thing with the PGs, there are times where maybe you want to call these out if you have to. This on a Dragon Tree marker with Magnolia Masques actually hits for 20k. With Sarah, it hits for 30k, which, you know, is still a pretty good number. It's, in most cases, 2 cards to guard, and that's just from a single trigger. We are playing, however, 4 copies of the normal draw, or the effect draw trigger, I should say, because while you can deck thin pretty well between searching out the masks, playing the order, stuff like that, Sarah, you really have no way to hard plus, especially to your hand. So we're playing max copies of the effect draws just to try and get a lot of draws into our hand. Hopefully it's an auto deck so we can actually draw into these triggers. Even if we don't check them, at least we have them in hand so we can guard with them. Then we have just 4 copies of the normal heal triggers for the same exact purpose as the crits. And then finally, we're playing here the Bless Favor, which is the best over trigger, I think, for this deck because it just does everything. Usually the other option would be like the blue over trigger, but this already does what the blue over trigger kind of does, because it lets you draw and get a crit and heal. So this is just the, I believe, the go-to trigger. So rapid fire, a couple of different options here. As I already mentioned, you can add in an extra copy of Godot. Since you're playing the Mythy Habitat, there's a good chance that you'll see the grade 1 when you need it, or the grade 2, so you can be a little bit looser and not have to play as many of the Dragon Tree Weps, because one of the main weaknesses of this deck also is that those cards don't do anything for you other than give you a marker. They're just vanilla 10Ks, so you kind of really need a lot of things that either hit with power or get you units. Those don't do either of that. They just use up Counterblast and Soul in order to get you extra attacks, which is nice, but after they serve their purpose, they're pretty useless. So you can add in an extra copy of that. For the Rideline, you can of course try and play the Lattice along with the Lepocore, because it works out pretty well. The Lattice, if you play less units, you might be higher chance of hit something. Of course, you will, 70% of the time hit a trigger. That's just the nature of this Rideline. But again, if you hit those triggers and it's on Dragon Tree markers, it's not the worst thing in the world. Of course, it would have been better to check those, but you catch my drift. Also, if you hit something like the Magnolia, you will have to call that out. So it's an option. Try it out if you'd like. On the same vein of the triggers, you can use the Aurora Rideline to get plant tokens. Again, 5k, 5 plus 15 becomes 20. Hits for a decent number, Persona Ride with Zero becomes 30. Something to consider. In a previous build, I was actually playing, I believe, a total of 8 orders, counting the Elementaria, and playing this Regalia. I kind of feel like the Regalias are 1 per deck for a reason. You should probably play at least 1 of them, is the logic that I've been trying to apply to most decks. And this is just really nice because it sometimes just counts as a PG because it guards for 38. It gives you 25k shield on a grade 3 Vanguard, that becomes 38. And it also removes a crit for something that has 100 point power, so it helps out when you're fighting and you get hit with an over trigger where it's really hard for the deck to come back from something like that. It also just counts as an extra order, so you can discard it for Rancor Chain in case you just don't need it or whatever the case may be, if you have to discard it. So that way you always hit Rancor Chain skill and you don't always discard 2 cards when you don't need to. Of course, there is the issue with the Soul. If you do play this, you have to play the extra 3 goats, the extra 1 goat, to make sure you always have some Soul in your deck, but it helps you Soul Blast out that goat. So if you Persona Ride, you can then put that goat into Soul to give your Magnolia Mask an extra 5k. Likewise, if you'd rather a unit for this, you can use the cat. This cat has a skill that when it's placed on Rear Guardian, you can put 2 cards from your Solar Drop that were originally your Ride deck back face up, and you can use one of these skills depending on what circle it was on. If it was placed on the Rear Guard, it gets a Soul Charge 2, and you give a unit plus 5k, which is okay. But also mainly, if you put it on Guardian Circle, it gets an extra 15k shield, so it becomes 20k shield, which is pretty nifty, especially because you can use this on turn 2, since you typically Soul Blast out your grade 0 for the Rancor Chain, and then you can Soul Blast out Rancor Chain for, the skill of your Dragon Tree Well. So then this all automatically becomes active from drop for basically for free, and it's 20k shield if you're going second against your opponent's grade 3 turn. So pretty good. Of course, the big elephant in the room. Oh, why don't you play Inland Pulse? It's just 3rd deck. You get more than 3 attacks. You should play this. Inland Pulse doesn't really do anything for the deck, to be honest. All it does is lets you get Soul and draw a card, but the Soul is at the end of the battle, so it's not that important. You have no easy ways to call this out aside from the 4-Skull Dragon, or if you manage to hit it off the Misty Habitat, in which case you probably want to hit something else, like maybe hit a Sterile, or maybe hit the Dragon Tree up to get more Dragon Tree markers. Plus, this just appears at the end of the battle, so next turn you have to fill up that slot somehow. But if you really want to run Inland Pulse, you can take out like the Alpins and run 2 of it instead. Go for it. I don't think it's going to work out that well. A better replacement, in my opinion, is the Tideline Dragon. Here that says, if you Persona Road, you Soul Blast 1, choose one of your units, and both the unit you chose and Tideline get plus 10k. So they hit in for really nice numbers, makes things go pretty burr. So I think this is a really good option, especially to replace the Alpin. But of course, if you don't hit Persona Ride, this does absolutely nothing. Okay, that is going to do it for this Magnolia video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope it was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments below. Like I said, I've done this video like this has to be like the 5th time that I've tried to record this, just because like I keep changing 1 or 2 cards, changing my mind about things. It's definitely a deck that I feel like has a lot of potential, and there's a lot of ways to play it and a lot of optimization that can be done. But I think it's also a deck that is very, you know, underplayed and is actually very strong right now, especially going into certain matchups. But nonetheless, take care of yourselves and each other, play Vanguard, and have yourselves a damn good one.